Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about my baby's 3-month-old update. So, in my last story, which was my birth story, I had talked about right up until our baby was born and how he had birth defect, where his esophagus was not formed correctly. And his stomach was attached to his airway. Now, they didn't pick this up in an ultrasound due to the fact that what was happening was the fluid was still in his stomach and still in his bladder. So they didn't pick it up on an ultrasound. But the reason for that was his esophagus came to a pouch. And when the pouch would overflow, it would overflow into his airway. And because his stomach was attached to his airway, it would then drain into his stomach. And then from then on to the bladder and everything else till it come out. So that's why they couldn't pick it up on an ultrasound. My doctor, who was Dr. Watson at Townsville Hospital, did have suspicions of something going on though. Because I had so much excess fluid and it was increasing rapidly, he did say there could be something wrong with the baby's digestive system. They just couldn't see what it was. So after birth, he had a thorough trek over, and they first figured out something was going on when they tried to stick a tube down his throat, and it wouldn't go anywhere. So they thought maybe he had a blockage. Obviously, being preemie, he had to have a breathing tube put in straight away, but he didn't need it for very long because he could breathe fine on his own. This is a precautionary thing that they had to do. They also had to try to put a feeding tube in, but nothing could go through because it was just nowhere for it to go. So they said, okay, well, there might be a blockage. Let's do an ultrasound to find out what's going on. As soon as they did the ultrasound, they saw exactly what was there, that the esophagus came to a pouch and that the stomach was attached to his airway. When they found out this, they immediately called a surgeon. The surgical peds team, they came, had a look, assessed. In this time, my parents had come back to me to tell me something was wrong, to prepare me, and told me that one of the peds surgical team members were going to come talk to me and give me a rough idea of what's wrong. So she did. She came over. She told me, she had a little picture that she had drawn to show me what was going on in there and what was going to happen, and that he needed to have surgery. And obviously at this point, you've just gone through this really long labor that started at 7:30 a.m. on the Monday and finished at 1:10 on the Tuesday, p.m. that is, not a.m. So I was in a very long labor, and then I got a surgeon coming here telling me my baby needs surgery. I'm thinking, okay, I was in shock. Okay, I half expected something. Obviously I didn't want anything, but I was prepared for it because my doctor did say that. So when they were like that, I'm like, okay, I need to get over there. I need to find out exactly what the surgeons are going to do. Once the surgeons figured out what they had to do, they come to the NICU, where I had gotten to by then in a wheelchair. And they had said, okay, we need to do surgery and we need to do it ASAP. We're going to do it first thing in the morning. He's very little. We need you to sign all these forms. So me and my husband were given forms for anesthetic to sign, for in case he needed a blood transfusion during surgery to sign, if he needed all these other things. Like, there were so many forms we had to sign. And we're like, just whatever, just do it. Like, there's nothing we can do. Excuse me. At the end of the day, he needed to have surgery, and we just had to hope for the best. So we did that. So the following morning, on the Wednesday, he had his surgery. He came out fine. The esophagus that they stitched was a little bit shorter than they were hoping, so it was higher in the throat where they had to do the stitching. So due to that, they didn't want to risk him moving his head. So they kept him sedated for 3 days. So he's completely out of it for 3 days. During this time, he wasn't on proper feeds. He was just on glucose drip. And he was on that until he got up. He was also had a breathing tube down his throat to help him breathe, only because he was sedated so much that sometimes babies forget to take a breath when they're sedated, especially being that little. So when he was born at 1:10 p.m. He only weighed 1.65 kilos, which is 3.6 pounds, 43 centimeters long, and 29 centimeters was his head circumference. So he's a very tiny baby. They told me he's a good size for 32 plus 2 weeks. So for his age, he was a good size, but obviously a very small baby to be born so early. So after we had his surgery done, we waited a week and the surgeons did what they call a swallow test. So this is where they take him down to ultrasound. They squirt this dye down his mouth and get him to swallow it. They're checking for 2 things. A, to see if he can swallow, and B, to see if there's a leak where they did the stitching. At this one, there was a leak. So they said, okay, we're going to give it another week and see if it heals over on its own. So we did that. We waited another week. We did the same test again, and it was still there, but it had gotten smaller. So they're like, it's getting better, so let's give it another week. So they did that. Before they got a chance to do that next one, he got an infection. Now this is where I started to get worried, because I knew he was starting to act a bit funny. And when I say that, what I mean is he is not your average baby. He doesn't cry unless he's sick or in pain. He sleeps so good. He'll sleep all night, and he's been like that since a newborn. He's just a sleepy baby. The only reason why I knew there was something going on with him when he got this infection was, even though he'd sleep all day, when he would wake up to get his cares done, so he'd do his cares, and during these cares he would get his eyes wiped out, he'd get his mouth wiped, he would get his ears, behind his ears wiped, around his neck, and then obviously a nappy change and all that. Would always wake up during that and be so happy and kicking around when he does that. When he started to stay asleep and not move the whole time he was getting cares done, that's when I knew something was up. I said to him, this is not him. He does not look right. But he kept doing weird things, like he'd go really pale for absolutely no reason at all. His stats were always perfect, never had fevers, never had spikes, never had problem with breathing, nothing. Heart rate was always perfect. His stats, if you had a doctor just come and had a look at his stats, you wouldn't even think anything was wrong with him. It was only the fact that he would sleep through his cares is when I started noticing. 3 days later, they then found a little bit of mucus in his drainage tube that was in his back. So when they had his surgery done, they had one tube that they inserted into the surgical site to drain out any fluid from where they did the surgery, so it wasn't building up inside of him. In this drainage tube, it had the normal looking fluid coming out. It had dwindled down, like there was barely any fluid coming out anymore, and they were almost talking about taking it out. Like that's how great it was going. Then just one morning we got up and there was a bit of mucus in it. Just a tiny little bit of mucus inside the tube that wasn't even inside him. There was none around where the tube was in his back. Nowhere. Just a little bit in the tube. So they tested it. And it came back with 4 types of bugs. So I'm like, oh my god. This little boy, so tiny, and he's got 4 infectious bugs. 2 of the main ones were staph and strep, MRSA. They were the worst. So he was on about 4 or 5 different types of antibiotics at this time. So they were just pumping all the stuff into him to try to get rid of it. Which in itself kind of, gave him a little bit of upset tummy because he was getting so much. He was having diarrhea a lot, and then he'd be constipated. Then he would get diarrhea again, and then he'd get constipated. Which they just said is mainly from the meds because he was on so much. So they decided to wait 2 weeks before doing another swallow test. So we did that. We waited the 2 more weeks for the infection to die off until the antibiotics had gone through. And then we did another swallow, and it was great. The leak had all healed up. And then all of a sudden, we went from being there in NICU for 5 weeks, everything just happening at such a slow pace. Then it's like, okay, leak's gone. If you can breastfeed today, you go into special care. All really quickly, everything just bang, bang, bang. All tubes are coming out. We're kicking you out. We're going over to special care. And I'm like, whoa, slow down. So we did that. So we did our first breastfeed. Now, I wasn't able to hold him in NICU for about a month. I could touch him in the bed, but I wasn't allowed to hold him. The first time I got to hold him was just after we found out he had the infection. Because they're like, if they were worried that he wouldn't get interaction and wouldn't have the fight to live, to keep fighting, if he didn't have some skin to skin. Basically, that's what they said to me. And it was so hard to see him going through all that and not be able to hold him. Like, it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, is not be able to hold my baby. So I wasn't able to hold him for the first time until 1 month old. And I was only allowed to do it maybe once every couple of days. Just because he still had all these tubes in him, and it was really hard to get him out of the bed. He couldn't wear any clothes until the tubes got him out, so, yeah, so when we finally went to special care, it was awesome. But, so that's when we started breastfeeding. Now, he had a little trouble breastfeeding at first because he is a preemie. His mouth was still very tiny. So with the help of nipple shields, we were able to breastfeed fine. My supply had dwindled down a bit in this time due to all the stress of everything going on, which has still gotten worse now, which I'll tell you why in a moment. Because since leaving the NICU, so he got to leave NICU on the 16th of December. So we were all excited because he was going to be home for his first Christmas. We're like, yes, we can finally breastfeed him. We did breastfeeding with formula top-ups with a bottle. It was so exciting. He got to come home for Christmas. So we were home for 2 weeks over Christmas and New Year's. Then we had to come back up to Townsville for a checkup with his surgeons, just because of his surgery he had. And when we went to that checkup, I had mentioned to them after we gave him a bottle and fed him, he'd get like this real loud crackling breathing sound, which was a little concerning to the doctor. He was about to say, oh, we'll keep an eye on it and we'll check it out next time, until he heard it. As soon as he heard it, he's like, okay, we need to do a test on this, find out what's going on. So he scheduled us to have a swallow test that day. When we did the swallow test, we found that he was aspirating when he was feeding. So a little bit of fluid was going into his airways. So immediately they were worried about ammonia. So they ended up admitting him into hospital. He spent a whole week in the children's ward trying to find different ways to feed him so he wouldn't aspirate. We tried thickening formula, we tried different positions, we've tried bottles, we tried all sorts of different things. Nothing seemed to work. So our last resort was to put in a feeding tube. They got a feeding tube put in, they sent us home with that after teaching me how to use it. And we got to come home for a week, but they said, we're going to let you go home, but we want you to come back in a week to have a scope procedure done. So an escape procedure is when they put a camera down your esophagus. Now there was two different ones they did. So the first ones they just have a look at the esophagus here at the top. Then the second one is they actually put the camera into your lungs and airways to have a look at all that, and then the lower part of your esophagus as well. In doing that, in the week he was at home, his aspirations got worse and worse, a lot more frequent than they were before. Before it was only just after feeds. With the feeding tube, he wasn't supposed to aspirate at all, but he still was, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. And I think what was happening was that he would reflux and then bring it up. And then as he brought it up, it'd be going into his airway. And because it got so much more and more frequent, he ended up getting ammonia. So when we were brought him up for his scope procedure, they did the procedure, they called me up straight away and said, you need to come back up to the hospital, we know what's wrong. They didn't get to do the lower part of the scope, only the top half, but that was because he kept gagging. So he wasn't taking the anesthetic very well. So they decided, no, we can see what's going on, we're going to stop now. They didn't want to put any more pressure on him. So what they found was a hole in his airway right above where the airways divide into the lungs. So he currently has a hole there. He is scheduled on the 19th of February to get that hole repaired. So we're just waiting. We're currently just gotten out of hospital after being in hospital for 2 weeks with his ammonia, and then he also got the rhinovirus after that, which wasn't fun, but he's getting over that now too. We're now staying at the Ronald McDonald House for another week or two till we have his surgery done to fix that up, where they're going to try a new technique of gluing the hole so that he doesn't have to go through another major surgery. So yeah, that's what's going on so far. He's just turned 3 months old on the 29th of January. And I can reveal to you his name and what he looks like. I'll just grab him. Just give me one moment. So this is our little Bobby. Hey, he's just woken up from a sleep. And his name is Oliver. Yeah. Yeah, so that's our little boy at 3 months old. He's still got his feeding tube in, but hopefully after his surgery, you won't have that anymore. Okay, thank you everyone for listening, and keep an eye out for Oliver's 6-month-old update. Thanks, bye. Say bye-bye. Bye-bye.